If you don't want to be easily manipulated, then listen to this. Why is it so easy to get caught up in the moment? The more that people around you are emotionally reacting, the more it pays for you to be patient and thoughtful and slower with your own perspective and your own emotions. Because emotions are contagious. When the people around you are caught up in a wave of emotions, your friends and your family, or the news that you're watching, or the people you're paying attention to, or the social networks and the streams of content and information and mood and feelings and attitudes that you are consuming and letting pass through your mind, where your emotions get triggered and created. The more that you are pulling in that emotionally reactionary charge, the more likely you are to get swept away, caught up in that and swept away like a wave, and your emotion gets carried with that crowd just like a wave before you get a chance to decide what's the best direction to swim. And why does that happen? Well, there's three reasons why we get caught up in the moment, and three reasons primarily why emotions are so contagious. The first is because we mimic what we see most. It's what we are wired to do as humans. I mean, if you have young kids, if you can go back to your own memory of when you were a young kid, this is how we learn. We watch, we mimic before we understand. And we don't ever lose that wiring in our brains. It's why crowds work the way that they do. It's why celebrity endorsements work well. It's why posts on Instagram are influential. We mimic what we see. And the more we see things, the more we tend to and start to mimic those things. And that's why we see behavior patterns developing between people and between groups and between influencers and the people that they influence. So the first is we mimic what we see. The second reason is because we use crowds to assess what we think is normal. That's also what we are wired to do. When we are trying to assess or evaluate what's normal, what's expected, what's in the range of acceptable, we look to the crowd that is most like us or that we most desire to be like. And we use whatever we see in that crowd, what the norm is, to gauge our measurement of what's normal and what's acceptable in this particular moment. As emotions ramp up, the norm changes, and we start to assess ourselves against that norm based on what the crowd is doing, sometimes even in violation of what we think or know to be right. And the third is because emotions, specifically a shared emotional experience, it creates a strong bond, and we crave as human beings connections. That's what we crave. And so when we get a shared emotional experience, it could be shared anger, it could be shared fear, and it can even be shared sadness or shared excitement. But it could also be shared enthusiasm. It could be shared disgust. It can be any kind of shared emotion creates that bond in between people and between groups. And we crave those connections. And so if you put these three things together, we mimic what we see, we use the crowd to assess what we think is normal, and then we're craving those bonds and those connections. And there's nothing that creates a stronger bond between people than a shared emotional experience. That's how we get caught up in a crowd. That's how we get caught up in the moment and a wave of emotion that we otherwise might not have said or done that thing, but the emotion of the moment can blind us. And it's because emotions are contagious according to those three standards. Where does this apply in our lives? Well, I think the first is anytime a crowd is emotionally charged. And that shows up in your life in any number of ways. It can show up in a kind of a disconnected way. If you look at whether it be, the mood of the public wherever you live, the mood of the country wherever you are, and you hearing what people are saying on the news. It could be, what's going on in your town or your community. It could be what's going on in the family. It's how an argument escalates. It's how the tension or excitement or optimism in a family, in a home elevates. Anytime you are in an environment where there are multiple people or there is a crowd and there is an emotional charge moving through that crowd, make sure you are separating between what the emotional charge of the crowd is, of the group, or even the other person, and what your emotion is. And there are times where you will meet that crowd because you are there, but make that an intentional choice. Don't get swept up in that wave and carried away by it. Be intentional about whether you participate in that or whether you don't, based on where your emotions are and what you want to be feeling and doing and participating in. And you have to remember what your standards are, because that's what emotions don't want us to remember. They just want us to pay attention to the emotion. And so you're going to find yourself in emotionally charged crowds and environments. And make sure in those moments you can separate between what the emotional charge of the group is and what the emotional charge inside of you is, and know the difference between those two things. Emotions don't want you to slow down, expand your view, and evaluate. Right? They want you to speed up, narrow your view, and react. Now, there's a time and a place for both of those. There's a time to slow down, evaluate, expand our view. There's a time to speed up, narrow down, focus, and get going and act on what we see. We don't want to react, but we do want to act. And sometimes we need to do that quickly. But understand what emotions want you to do. Emotions want you to narrow everything, focus only on them, and react. So for you, you need to decide, when do I need to slow down and expand, evaluate? When do I need to speed up, narrow, and act? But that's not for the crowd to decide. That's not for some other emotion in a group to pick you up and carry you in one of those two directions. It's for you to decide for yourself. So why do you think people tend to get caught up in the moment? Why do they get caught up in the emotion of the crowd? Let me know what you think in the comments. Everything is training for something. Do the work.